Trauma is actually a very common experience. Research shows us that 75% of Canadians have experienced a significant traumatic event, like the death of a loved one, or a sexual assault, or seeing someone badly injured or killed. Trauma is hard for all of us, but it's especially challenging for youth. Teachers can assume that most kids in their class have experienced something difficult or traumatic that will be impacting the way they act. There are many different types of trauma and different levels of severity, but the most important thing to remember about trauma is that its impacts are based on how the person experiencing it thinks and feels, not what actually happened. What can seem like no big deal to one person can have devastating impacts to another. It's more important to understand how to respond to what you see in your student in the moment than it is to understand all of the details of their past. Anytime you see a student acting in ways that harm themselves, like hanging around people that are cruel to them, or not handing in their schoolwork, or physically harming themselves, this is most likely due to a traumatic experience that they've gone through. At the same time, if you see students hurting others, this is also usually the result of trauma. The way trauma impacts kids can be quite extreme, and the reason for this is because the childhood brain has no perspective. When something hard happens, they have no way of contextualizing it or understanding it. Their survival instinct kicks in to try to keep them safe by trying to figure out what might have caused this awful experience. And because their perspective is so limited, their minds usually settle on the idea that they must be the problem. This is why, no matter how irrational it is, most kids consciously or unconsciously think that what happens to them is their fault. This is why trauma is so devastating. The problem is not the experience itself. People can adapt and cope to many different things. The problem is that our mind internalizes the experience and can't put it into perspective. This causes kids to form a belief system about the world based on their trauma. For example, if a child is abused, they might start thinking that they're not worthy or lovable. If a child loses a parent, they might start thinking that if they had done something different, this wouldn't have happened. Their mind becomes fixated on the event, and it repeats over and over again in their mind. This clouds their judgment and acts a little bit like a lens over everything they experience and every interaction they have. For example, any trauma that involves another person, like being harmed or mistreated in some way, will result in kids struggling to know how to interact with others. They might violate other people's boundaries easily, or they might have their own boundaries violated by others easily. They do these things because their minds are repeating what they experienced in their trauma. Whenever we see kids responding in a way that doesn't fit the situation, like maybe they're responding in a much bigger or a much smaller way than makes sense from an external perspective, this is usually because they're not just reacting to the immediate situation, they're also reacting to their past experiences. What we see as mental health issues are usually closely tied in with these experiences of trauma, because trauma is what causes our minds to form patterns like anxiety and depression. We get caught in negative cycles because we've experienced negative cycles. The best thing teachers can do is to help students reconceptualize what's happened to them. We want to help them change the narrative in their own minds. And the only way they can do this is if they start speaking about what happened to them. This doesn't have to happen in class, of course. It's important for students to have individual conversations with a counselor or a psychologist to help them process what they've been through. But teachers can help tremendously by being aware that illogical and out-of-context reactions are showing what students have been through. The best thing we can do is not get caught in the story the student's trauma is telling. If they're acting like the bad kid or like they're worthless, don't allow this to be the way you're seeing them. If you respond differently than the way they're encouraging you to respond, you're helping shift their story. Teachers can also help a great deal by creating a culture in their classroom where students regularly share their struggles. They can set up a weekly or a daily check-in where each student shares one struggle and one joy in their day. Simply hearing that other people struggle and practicing saying their struggles out loud changes how likely it is for students who've experienced trauma to move through it and define themselves differently.